Today, when people think about data centers, we talk about kilowatts and megawatts and all of these things. What is often not talked about is the interconnectivity. So, how important is the interconnect between different data centers now that you're running a big portfolio of them?
Today, most data that's stored is computed against, and therefore data needs to be transported in order to facilitate that. We have interconnected all of our data centers with our own network elements. I think 365 was at the forefront.
Today's guest is Bob DeSantis, CEO of 365 Data Centers. With decades leading major telecom, cloud, and data center companies, Bob has scaled businesses, driven acquisitions, and shaped the future of connectivity.
Over the next 5 years, we're going to continue to see data generation grow exponentially. And assuming that's going to grow exponentially, there's going to be a growing need to store data and compute against data. And therefore, there's no doubt that these hyperscalers are going to benefit measurably from that. There will continue to be a big growth opportunity for enterprise data center operators, non-hyperscale. I don't know how this is going to play out, but we have been approached and we have studied at least 3 now. SaaS AI developed models where the developers are claiming that a customer, who might want to spend $1 million, buy equipment that will allow them to do inferenced AI, are going to need densities up to 33 kW running constantly, up to 50 at a peak. There are models coming out saying, if we deploy this model in your data center, we're going to eat up to 5 kW per cabinet, what they otherwise think they need 50 kW. Music to my ears.
Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to FutureScale's Built to Scale, where we talk to thought leaders and industry experts about technology impact and scaling. Today, we're pleased to have join us Bob DeSantis, CEO, founder, and board member of 365 Data Centers, a leading data center operator in the US. And as I recently learned, a man in transition who will be stepping down at the end of the year, but has graciously given us the opportunity to get his thoughts on data centers and evolution. So, welcome, Bob. And first off, tell us about your background and how you got into the data center business.
Thanks, Kevin, for asking me to join you today. It's always a pleasure. Well, it's interesting. When I think back on my career, I don't think it was designed to be a data center career at the outset. But when I think about the experiences along the way, I think they've all added up to lead into, all the skill sets you need to be running a data center. So I started off in the Big Eight as an accountant, and it's always good to be able to count. There's a lot of metrics in our industry, as you know, so that's helpful. I then spent quite a bit of time as a tax lawyer in the telecommunications industry, hence my, involvement with communications. And then I spent about 15 years as CFO of a large multi-state utility business throughout the United States, diversified utility. So I really got a chance to learn the power industry in and out, and clearly, that's been a contributor. While part of a public company, we spun off a metro fiber business, so became very familiar with metro fiber bills and funding and the benefits of metro fiber and what it does throughout the industry, and particularly now the data center industry. Also had experience bringing public through an IPO network equipment business, so got to know the network elements of the communications business, beyond just the circuit elements of it. And then was fortunate to work with two, very good partners, an operating partner, kind of a sales partner, whereas I handled the financial and the administrative aspects of the business, and got me a real taste of the internet services business, the IP transit business. It was that group when we sold that business said, what should be our next endeavor? And we thought, having run our own internal data centers over the year and, understanding what was coming on the data front, or at least having a little precursor as to what might come about, we decided to found Xand, which was a single site, very small data center operator in Westchester County, New York. But the idea was to grow that, through acquisition.
Okay.
And over a 4-year period, we did just that and grew it about 10 times, and sold that business to TierPoint in 2014. In 2017, I co-founded what is now 365. It's a little bit of a different road, but I'd say, a good 20, 22 years of my career were in public companies and learning a lot of the piece parts. And I say the last 25 years, I've been taking adventures, and they've all been very interesting, some challenging, but on balance, I'm glad I repotted myself from public company world 25 years ago.
Oh, I love that term repotting. Let me take advantage of that. Because today when people think about data centers, we talk about kilowatts and megawatts and all of these things, but what is often not talked about enough, I think, is the interconnectivity. And I really want to kind of mine your deep experience in this space. So, how important is the interconnect between different data centers now that you're running a big portfolio of them, and managing things like traffic rates and service for your clients?
Well, that's a very good question, Kevin. If I think back 15 years ago, data centers were space, power, and cross connects. Any of the connectivity, was carrier dependent. The more carriers you got as into your meet me room, or even if you were fortunate enough to have them take space with you and pay for it, that was the norm. But you got to think about co-location data centers as compute and storage. And if the storage is going to sit there and not be computed on, connectivity really isn't important. But as you well know, today, most data that's stored, most of it, the great majority of it, is computed against,
Yes.
and therefore data needs to be transported in order to facilitate that. So, I think 365 was at the forefront. I think Xand was at the forefront of that. And so, we have interconnected all of our data centers with our own network elements. And, we could talk a little bit more about that a little later, I guess, but in this conversation, if you have some interest. But, I think we are at the forefront of that. And, with inference to AI now becoming, even more relevant to the data center space, that inference AI means that data sets, which are going to be much bigger data sets, need to be transported. So, again, I'm glad we are at the forefront. We call ourselves a network-centric data center, and there's a lot of elements to being network-centric, not the least of which is having a great number of carriers actually being our customers in our data centers, and that allows for a lot of connectivity options in and out of the data centers and among them.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about that because I see from your corporate deck that over 20 centers, right? Something like 80 megawatts of compute powered, 100 gigabytes of redundant network fiber. So, how do you actually think about these kinds of numbers and performance?
Yeah, well, I would say, the capacity in terms of power in megawatts and the bandwidth capacity of our backbone or, our IP transit network, they're loosely connected. Now, don't get me wrong, the more customers you have, the more compute going on with the data that's stored, the more network you need.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say there's a direct correlation. I'd look at it more in terms of the market demand, if I could go there, maybe. Years ago, maybe even only 5 years ago, up to 5 years ago, the norm for a retail customer would have been 200 to 500 meg, an SMB customer of internet access or transport requirement. And, the minority, but the growing minority, of commercial accounts were looking for a gig up to 10 gig of transport and, of DIA. Today, 5 years later, that's changed measurably. The 1 gig that used to be at the higher end is now at the lower end, up to 10 gig, more at the lower end, the norm. And 100 gig, is what the minority, still the minority, but yet a growing minority are looking for. So in 5 years, that has grown tenfold.
That is better than Moore's Law, right?
Yeah. So, if I try to look at our megawatts compared to our gig, the megawatts are going to grow based on acquisition or bills, but, the demand for connectivity bandwidth, has just grown independent for that. And that's why I say they're loosely connected. And, investments today are, you can read all about it, anybody in the network business. Now, again, that's not our main business, but we were, I think, had the foresight to add it in as part of the mix. But, anyone in the carrier business today is doing 400 gig, as any new deployment. So it kind of tells you that I think bandwidth is catching up and probably will get ahead of the power capabilities of the data centers, and necessarily so.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and it's interesting. So again, you mentioned as part of 365 that you have 80 pops, which was new for me, points of presence. Can you explain how that ties into what you were just talking about?
Well, everything I just talked about would apply to all of them, but just to kind of make it a little clearer. So we have 20 data centers. All 20 of those data centers, we have network equipment deployed, and we have circuits coming out of those redundantly, and they interconnect with all the other data centers. So all 20 data centers are interconnected that way. But as you point out, we have 80 additional points of presence for our network gear. So that means, these are sites where we do not operate the site. We would lease space from either a landlord or another data center. In many cases, it is another data
Oh,
center
okay.
operator in the industry. So we're effectively a customer of theirs, and we have our network equipment. Now, why are we there? Well, we would have customers that would want to go from point A to point B. We would call point A, say, a data center, and point B, a non data center. And because of the particular opportunity for that customer and the return on the particular investment, we would actually extend our network, and we've done that nationwide,
Oh, okay.
not to compete with the Zaos and the Lumens and the AT&Ts, but to satisfy our customer needs so we can provide them with the whole package. Now, there's an ancillary benefit of that. If we have a pop in Phoenix where we don't have a data center, and we have a customer that would like to be at one of our data centers, say in Richardson, Texas, or in Denver, we can bring that customer's connectivity onto our overall network in Phoenix. And then we can transport them just like we could from another data center into our Dallas data center, or maybe our Denver for backup. And therefore, our geographic maybe limitation of 20 data centers where they sit can be enhanced by having a more of a nationwide network, which is built on points of presence or POPs.
So you mentioned investments, which I want to key in on. So there's the investment in an ecosystem, a partnership ecosystem, but also the actual acquisition of the data center itself. So maybe you could step us through what you look for in terms of characteristics and potential synergies with your existing portfolio when you evaluate acquiring a new site.
Yeah. Well, we have been acquisitive. I mean, the company was built by acquisition, so I can't even count them all, maybe six at this point. But we have a very disciplined way of looking at this. And it kind of starts with product set. If we're going to acquire an entity, we want to make sure that entity in and of itself overlays our product set in a nice way or slightly complements it. So, in other words, we're not out there trying to buy a cloud business that goes way up the cloud stack. We're not out there trying to buy a business that does application development. We're trying to buy businesses that have a combination of co-location services, maybe singly co-location services, but also some network elements, whether it's the network equipment or the network circuit element, and particularly, having, profitable segments within. Obviously cloud businesses at the right level, since, we don't go way up the cloud stack, but we focus on the basics: cloud compute, cloud storage, disaster recovery as a service, backup as a service, managed firewalls, things like that. So if it fits our product set, then we feel, it's aligned. Secondly, and very importantly, is geography. I've seen companies, I've worked at companies that, have 50 data center locations, and that's fine. But, if they're just small locations with, scattered all over the map, management wise, that can be a little difficult. So, 17 of our 20 data centers are Chicago and east of Chicago. We have gone west of Chicago on 3 occasions, which was really customer driven. It's customers who might have big deployments with us in the east and, need to have something in a market like Texas, like Denver, like outside of Sacramento, but those are our only three. So we're very focused on product set and geography. We are also focused on acquiring businesses that are well maintained, businesses that are profitable. We haven't bought greenfield businesses or built
Okay.
them. That's been outside of our strategic focus. So those are kind of the things that we've tried to be, what I'd say, very disciplined about, and we have been disciplined about. And, we don't really want to go more than 9 months, or if it's something that's doubling the business, more than 12 months without fully integrating everything from the financial aspects to the customer facing aspects to the physical attributes of the facility. So, there's certain type of capital that comes about that, we need to invest to properly integrate
Right.
those businesses. But that's how you get the synergies out of these businesses by, in my view, leveraging the multiples of a larger business like ours by buying something that's regional or single site that doesn't demand a purchase price at our valuation. So we will put in the sweat equity, and believe me, it's a lot of sweat equity to integrate. Not everybody does it well. And, you get the value increation, by getting the higher corporate multiple on something you can buy at a value that it's worth.
Okay. Well, we don't need to go into the administrative or the managerial or strategic aspects per se, but since a lot of our listeners are in the technology domain, and you make an acquisition, and you talk about leveling up and integrating and looking for those synergies. Are there obvious types of hardware kind of considerations that you will be looking at in terms of making sure it meets the rest of your portfolio?
Yeah, that's a real big part of it. We'll probably do 2 to 3 due diligence visits. Obviously the first one to get comfortable on moving ahead, but the follow up ones are more designed to inspect every element of the infrastructure from the bottom up to determine, what its remaining useful life is. And I don't mean manufacturers remaining useful life. I mean, putting practical infrastructure operators' eyes on it to say, this is something that has to go into our capital plan over the next so many years. And also, do we need resiliency capital? And how we define that is something we better fix pretty quick, because if an event occurs, and knock on wood, we've never had one, but if an event occurs, we don't want that event to be deemed to be our operation of it, a 365 issue, when in fact, it could fall on its face on day one. So, we budget resiliency capital for those type of things and make it a priority in our first 12 months of operations. And that could be anything from cooling systems to UPSs to, fire alarms to, even generator upgrades if necessary.
And we may get into this a bit later, but you did mention this idea of growing minorities, right? So you target primarily small and medium sized businesses, but of course, the headlines are being captured by the hyperscalers of the world and all of the promises that should come, or hopefully will come. Speaking of knocking on wood, but how would you compare and contrast those two markets? How should people think about those things? Not as an integrated whole, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't look at it as an integrated whole in every respect, but there are some overlaps. The hyperscalers, clearly, I think are going to win and continue to pull away on, something that some of the cloud hyperscalers also impacted traditional colo by. And that is, if a customer is looking purely for storage, they're not going to have much need to pull that data,
Right.
in and out of where it sits, whether it sits in the cloud, whether it sits at a hyperscaler. The investments that big public clouds and hyperscalers on the colo side can make, are going to make the pricing for colocation services, cloud services, cheaper than what I saw you say traditional colo if it's just for storage, just because the investments they're making in storage arrays and in their facilities. And also, I think, when you start getting to the higher density requirements that generative AI has brought, generative AI, I think, is going to land with all the hyperscalers. You're not going to see, because, there are just going to be certain folks that are going to build data centers to serve, 100 plus KW per cabinet. And
Yeah.
believe me, a lot of people are taking bets on that right now, right?
Yes.
And they
Yes.
might be good bets or not. And I think we're going to be out till the beginning of 28 before we can decide whether some of those were good bets or not good bets. However, traditional colo is going to continue to grow. It may not grow in double digits, but it's certainly going to grow in high single digits. And that's really based on customer segments, in my view. Carriers are going to remain in traditional colo. We have over 100 carrier paying customers with about 275 points of presence that they have within our 20 data centers, right? So, that's going to continue to grow. Carriers got to be there to interconnect with other carriers and all their traditional colo customers. Enterprise customers, particularly in certain segments, and I would say hospital systems, number one, financial services businesses, right there with them. Pharma, clearly. Higher education that has a lot of proprietary data. Certain elements of the tech industry that have proprietary data that they sell to drive their revenue. That data, is not really ever going to be cloud oriented, in the majority of it. The majority of it is going to remain traditional colo just because of the proprietary nature of it. And, the inferenced AI aspects of those businesses are not as great as those businesses that are less service oriented as opposed to more product oriented and manufacturing oriented. So I think traditional colo, in certain segments that are leaning colo only and much less cloud, or had a cloud first strategy back in 15 and then revisited that in 19 and again maybe in 23, 24, are always going to grow the traditional cloud colo business. The interdependency, I believe, and I'm broadening this now to cloud operators as well as hyperscalers. The interdependency is that many customers find, and particularly if you get into the content providers, like the cable companies, the social media companies, they need to keep data at the edge for all the application users, all the cable subscribers, and the hyperscalers also have customers like that, and they need to have them at the edge. So, I had predicted about 7 years ago that at some point, edge data centers would become wholesalers to the hyperscalers.
Oh,
Again,
interesting. Kind of a
wholesalers
hybrid
to the
model. Yep.
hyperscalers.
Okay.
And, we have been. Without mentioning names, we have hyperscalers that sit in our data centers just so they can, connect their customers that might want to be in a hyperscale data center, user needs, whether it's the company itself, whether it's their customers at the edge. So I think there's going to be a healthy relationship for years to come. And if you are network centric as we are and have, public cloud on ramps as part of our network services, you're going to position yourself for more of that hybrid sharing, at least on the cloud side too. So I think it's becoming more and more of a integrated ecosystem. But being network centric allows that. If we weren't network centric, I don't think I could, feel
Offer
as
those
strongly
kinds of
about it.
things. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this idea of this hybrid environment, and then you mentioned the kilowatts per cabinet or rack, 100 to 200 kilowatts. Some of the conversations that we've been having have contemplated 600 kilowatts, even a megawatt, which one person characterized as a blast furnace at that point. How does that bleed through down through the entire ecosystems of colos?
As far as density you're talking about?
Yeah, and I'm thinking about how do you own and operate because do you get more vertical? Obviously, real estate is very expensive. Permitting is what it is, but you have a set footprint in an acquisition. But now you actually have to have more power per square foot, and that obviously affects the space, the cooling, all of these things.
Well, yeah. So, I think most of the industry will refer to that as, KW per cabinet, and, cabinets being, anywhere from 25 to 30 square foot of your space, depending on the type of cabinet, maybe even slightly bigger now with some of the, water cooled cabinets. We spent a lot of time on this for the obvious reasons, because the market was calling. I think this really started at the first quarter of 2023, and 365 data centers that has 80 megawatts across the system, was getting calls from, either representatives or directly from, generative AI businesses that, can you guys get us 10 megawatts? And I'm saying, geez, even if I could sell it, where do they think I'm going to get it? I mean,
Right, right.
I have it across the system, but not necessarily all in one location. And then it became pretty clear that the reason they were calling us is because the larger businesses, couldn't handle it either.
Right.
And it was going to take them 9 months to build it. And, people couldn't wait. But as our customer base started to think about AI, it clearly fell into the category. And again, I may be wrong, and I've been wrong, at least 10 times a week in my career. Um, but I attribute all this high density to AI. We've had data centers that were built for up to 12 kW per cabinet, built that way, designed that way, and we could certainly get up to 15 easily,
Oh, okay.
by, as you're saying, steal a little bit of space and,
Yeah.
strand a little space and redirect a little power. But, most of our customers have told us and, back in the summer of 23, and, now it's a little more refined, but I don't think it's full clarity. I think that the 100 kW and greater per cabinet are certainly going to be needed. I think those are going to be at the far right end of the bell curve. And there are going to be players out there who we all know are building for that and already have built for that. And as well as having cabinets built for that already. I do think, there's going to be, a high demand, up to 75 kW per cabinet. But our bet is the bell curve, the middle of that bell curve, Kevin. Our bet is that's going to be anywhere from 15 to 50. And I think more likely, 25 to 50. And, to upgrade facilities or reconfigure facilities like ours that aren't necessarily built for that, the incremental cost to go to 50 from 35 is de minimis as of today. We spent a lot of time, and I'm sure all the operators that are like us, that were not built for that, have spent a lot of time, looking at their facilities. So we looked at 20 facilities and we had various criteria like how much power do we have? How much power could we use there for high density and not cannibalize power that our traditional colo customers, say up to 15 kW per cabinet, are going to need to grow into? Where do we have chilled water plants already on the site? Where can we build chilled water plants on the site? Because obviously it's a requirement. And, what markets would be in the most demand, like the Northeast, like Atlanta, like Texas, like some of the area, Bay Area. And, we did our own criteria and, have come to the conclusion, and we've already started that effort, that we should upgrade to up to 50 kW, where appropriate for us over time. So, that's kind of our take on it. I do think we're going to be to the end of 2027 where we see where this rising tide kind of ends for where it resolves for
Results.
everybody that's
Yeah. Okay.
currently in the industry for a while at least.
Right, right, right. Well, we've talked about KWs. One of the things that people are very interested in, of course, is decarbonization. And related to that is this idea of 24/7 carbon free electrons, pioneered by Google and UN. And this has kind of created more interest in renewable energy and maybe even site specific resiliency options for operators. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, practically related to our business, there's a narrow segment of our business that's focused on that, and I mean our customers, so I'll address that. Then I'd be happy to address it more broadly outside the scope of 365, just based on a little intellectual curiosity I've had in that space and some prior experience. As far as our carbon emissions requirements and our standing, with various groups, only in the last 2 to 3 years has that come to our attention as a requirement from our customer base. And I could probably count right here on this hand the number of customers. And they're all European based customers.
Okay. Right.
I haven't had a large US customer say, I got to know how you stand in terms of your carbon efficiencies, your ratings. It's from the culture of the regulated culture in Europe that,
Yeah.
and non-regulated, but peripherally, impacting regulators in Europe. And so, it's had an effect. We've gone ahead and registered data with various, you know, global, depositories of data that,
Right.
put a rank out there. And, we were happy to see we passed everything. We never really had to check it out, but without putting a lot of effort. Now, do we have environmental approaches to what we do? Absolutely. We purchase power. We try to buy a large component of, green power where we can. Our data centers have lighting in them. We try to do whatever we can for energy efficiency, for lighting. We purchase cooling systems all the time. We try to get up on the upper scale of that. We're probably putting the smallest dent in the world, all of us that are operating retail to enterprise data centers and not hyperscale, but, it's had a little bit of an effect. More broadly speaking, outside of 365, when I think about the energy industry and where it needs to go, I mean, short of us building nuclear power plants all throughout the US, which will, solve all the environmental issues, right?
Right.
Won't have any environmental issues as long as there are no issues with the plants. Will certainly bring costs down for everyone. Can certainly have supply growing exponentially, and but I don't see that necessarily happening
Right. Right.
again in the term. I think if initiatives that were published in the last, I guess, 2 years. The Biden administration put out a comprehensive, energy development mandate. I don't know if I think that was an executive order. Um, and the Trump administration last July put out a very comprehensive, in many cases, very similar. And I happen to, peruse through both of them. It's more of an intellectual curiosity. And I must say, it was the first time I've seen the government, outside of FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, actually issue a comprehensive document that touched on everything, from land development to what utilities in place might consider doing. It even included a data center initiative, or at least, steps that were designed to get ahead of the data center demand at some point. And I really do think that if those initiatives, by at least the current administration, are driven with a lot of private public partnerships, uh, I do think our kids, our grandkids, are going to be in a much more energy independent world and without worries about our data centers eating up too much power. While I haven't had to worry about being a contributor to that at 365 because, we only have the 80 megawatts, I certainly know in dealing with a lot of development authorities around the country that they certainly understand the benefits that, maybe a data center that hires 10 people to operate it, generates in terms of all the business, in that community that is dependent on data and otherwise wouldn't exist if data centers didn't exist. So back to energy, I do think that a lot of work needs to be done. I think there's some very comprehensive, for the very first time, comprehensive frameworks. And I do think if the larger data center businesses engage not only with their government partners, who can be partners in this case, because at least in this administration, I know they're supportive of energy growth, and a lot of others, that serve the energy industry, in terms of suppliers. I think this could be a home run, but, a lot of work's been done. The question will be, how much follow up on those initiatives. That's my personal view, not a 365 view, by the way.
Sure. 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 And And I know you've touched on certain aspects of this as well, but questions that we get a lot are about flexibility and the interactions between data centers and whether it's possible using backup systems to actually sell electricity or to actually do kind of complicated PPAs and offtake agreements. And I agree with you in the future that everything will be sorted out. But in the meantime, the question, of course, is grid sufficiency and what do we need to do to get to that point. So I don't know if you've had any interactions with utilities or any thoughts about how flexibility might work or should work.
Well, I mean, overall, my years in the industry, there have been demand response programs, in place. And, for your listeners, that's where you might decide to come off the utility grid and go on generator for a period of times. And, these can be very, very helpful to a data center's financial performance, meaning, if you've got enough backup generator capacity, there in certain states, there are capacity charges and cap rates, as they're called, and things of that nature, where, the utility will take a handful, sometimes only 2 days a year, and they'll take the peak loads that are on their system. And of course, in, climate sensitive areas like the Northeast, that's going to be in
Mm,
July and August generally.
right.
It can be any time of year in some of the warm climates that have these programs. And if you're off the grid at that point, it's great because if you're on the grid, then they will allocate certain charges that need to be passed through based on your particular share of that high point demand on the grid. So if you're focused on those programs and you can, with all the data that a lot of people around the industry can provide you, if they're counseling you on this, you might just pick the right 2 days. You might pick one of those 2 days.
Right.
And by the way, this is always between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. in the evening because that's when businesses are still going and a lot of people are home already,
Yeah.
using the grid for their home use. That's the
Interesting.
high point. So we've taken advantage of that over the years and it can mean a significant reduction in your base annual costs, for a period that usually begins 5 months after they calculate all this. And then that gets put on for 12 months as a fixed charge. And if you can avoid that or mitigate it, that's a big help. And of course, you can also use your generators to, you know, get repaid for all your, fuel that you use for the generators if you come off. So there's benefits there. And then, of course, as you know, the regulated utility loves it because they don't have to worry about brownouts or
Yeah.
any types of risks and credits to their customers. So, we've always taken advantage of those type of things. We always take advantage of energy efficiency, rebates provided in various states, and those have been out there for years, and we constantly do that. Have we've had any of our, I'd say, 17 utility companies come to us? I think just because of our size, they're probably not going to come to us and try to put something in place. But I know from my industry peers, there's a lot of dialogue going on with them. Now, beyond that, all of us in the industry get probably a solicitation a month on alternative, energy development within our campuses that would, whether it's, gas fired or gas based or solar or you name it. There are some investments to be made, there are some co investments. But again, I think those are more appropriate for the larger scale users.
Well, in terms of cloud services, I mean, Salesforce gets a lot of credit for inventing kind of, or actually driving a lot of growth in cloud-based services. Given the massive capacity expansion that we're seeing across the board here, what I'm trying to get from your point of view and experience is, does that drive innovation of new types of cloud services that depend on your data centers? Do you see anything like that happening?
Yeah, I'll answer that in particular. And another thing, as you just mentioned, that came to mind that yeah, I'm kind of hoping comes through, but I'll get to that later. Well, look, this is when I'm out socially and people say, what's the cloud? What does that mean for you? And I try to keep it. I try to keep the Bob's Morons guide, which I like to have for myself in the back of my head. And I say, for those of us who have watched the following progression. There was co-location, back 2008, 9, 10. Which encouraged my original partners and I, as I shared with you at the beginning of
Yeah.
this, to get involved in looking at data center operations as a roll-up. And then a lot of colo customers said, I really don't want to have to keep coming into the data center and keep technicians on staff. Would you take my gear and have your folks or you staff up a little bit, to manage my servers, routers? And that was called managed services, back in 2010, 2012. And yeah, okay, fine, give us your gear. And so, we build a section of the data center that only our people could go into. And that would be our managed service section. Customers couldn't go in. And we would bill people to manage their everything down to the operating system level. And this is going to get to your technology question in a minute. And, then customers started coming saying, you know what? Not only do I not want to send people into the data centers, but I don't even want to do the equipment refreshes. Can you buy the equipment for me? Can I use your balance sheet? And, get your ROI by charging me an OpEx. Well, okay, so really it was all the same thing. And, it just changed the bill. And, some of our procurement where maybe we get better pricing because we bought more volume. And then all of a sudden, something like VMware came out and you can make virtual machines out of the equipment. And, all of a sudden people were saying, well, instead of my doing the refresh, I'm saying you're doing the refresh and my paying for it. Can you work these virtual machines so I can just pay for my portion of it?
Ah, right.
Hence the new term cloud. That's cloud.
Right. Right.
Cloud was shared managed services, but it was no different in managed services. So where did cloud sit? In a data center.
Right.
If I have a customer that wants to go to the cloud, that data, that storage is in somebody's data center. The hyperscaler cloud operators are in data centers. Now, many of them built their own. We have about 10% of our revenue coming from cloud operators. So whatever drives customers on the SaaS basis to the cloud, particularly if there are colo customers that might be using an on-prem application, and that looks like a risk to us. And I've started to think over the years, most of the business we've lost to cloud, a good number of it comes back to us now that we have seen all these local and regional cloud operators become our customers because the regional and local ones can't build their own data centers.
Right.
Um, and then I'll share one last thing with you on the AI. I mean, on that's AI related. I don't know how this is going to play out, but we have been approached and we have studied at least three SaaS AI developed models
Okay.
where the developers are claiming at this point, we'll have to have the rubber hit meet the road here, but claiming that a customer, say a customer of ours, who might want to spend $1 million to buy equipment that will allow them to do inferenced AI,
Right.
even if they're not doing their own models, and are going to need densities, up to 30, 33 kW running constantly, up to 50 at a peak, hence my bell curve before. There are models coming out saying, if we deploy this model in your data center, we're going to eat up to 5 kW per cabinet.
Wow. Okay. Wow. All right.
Music to my ears
Right.
at the
Right.
edge, right? And you'll be able to sell your customer, or we'll jointly sell your customer a subscription to this. They could do on 5 kW what they otherwise think they need 50 kW to do. Now, if this was one off, which I saw the first one a year ago, I'd be saying whatever, but now they're popping up. And so I'm wondering if edge data centers maybe 4 years from now, become the epicenter of inference cloud without the bets on 100 kW or even 50 kW. But, you got to hedge your bets and make some of those bets. So,
Right. Right.
who knows if some of these big bets will end up to be, above where they need to be. And, will we be back in the CLEC world of it overbuild at some point? Who knows?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that in the world of electrons, because we're definitely seeing this in the manufacturing world where, for the last 50 to 100 years, it's been centralized, scalable manufacturing with transport and distribution coming afterwards. But now, with grid resiliency, microgrids, nanogrids, grid independence, distributed manufacturing, reducing scope 3 emissions, reducing transport supply chain risk. I think the world is actually contemplating a lot of different things here. So this idea of distributed electrons is kind of interesting to me. But maybe on that note, let me ask my last question, Bob. And so, drawing on your multi-decade experience from telecoms to connectivity to data centers to now AI and its implications for business models, um, and the fact that you are transitioning. So I'd like to ask this question. So 5 to 10 years from now, what are we talking about that most people are not even thinking about today?
Well, you know what? I've learned years ago that 5-year forecasts are necessary, but it's very hard to do years 4 and 5, let alone 10. So I think over the next 5 years, we're going to continue to see data generation grow exponentially. I think the last time I looked, it was 5 billion gigabits a day, are being generated. Unfathomable, right? But in assuming that's going to grow exponentially, there's going to be a growing need to store data and compute against data. And therefore, there's no doubt that these hyperscalers are going to benefit measurably from that. I think the big public cloud operators, the public clouds, even private cloud at scale is going to benefit measurably from that. I think there will continue to be a big growth opportunity for enterprise data center operators, non-hyperscale, because the majority of that data generation, it's going to require to be close to the users. I think automated cars are going to continue to be a case where maybe my grandchildren will never have to learn how to drive a car. And you can think about all the robotics and everything
Absolutely.
else related to
Right.
that. So I think enterprise data centers are going to benefit measurably from that. But I do think the connectivity side is going to become most critical to all of that. And where data has to be transported for the compute or to get out to the edge from the say core hyperscale data center storage, connectivity is going to be 400 meg minimum. It's going to grow to something that even the equipment manufacturers haven't designed. So I think there's going to be opportunities there for the network equipment manufacturers to get ahead of this. And I do think power initiatives, as I said before, I do think there's going to be traction there. I think some of these government driven kind of systematic outlines are going to be filled in, most likely in different ways. We may go back to there's a book out there called The Big Switch. I would suggest all your readers look at it. It talks about how we went from a segregated, power generation world to a centralized grid, and how data followed that through the 70s, 80s, and 90s to data centers and centralized collection of data. We might see, I think, in many many cases, maybe a reversal of that on the power side. We might actually see, and we're starting to see, some news of it, but we might see some of these large data center operators run their own power plants. You're already reading about that a little. So, that might be a good analogy to look at. But at the end of the day, I think 5 years from now, the data center investors, data centers are going to grow. The investors in data centers are going to grow. I think there's going to be more than just the large infrastructure fund investors in data centers. I think that's going to come in many ways through many interrelationships, whether that be with hybrid infrastructure investor, hyperscale infrastructure investors today saying we're so bullish on this market, we'd like to come down scale and keep the businesses separate, but we'd like to own more edge. I think
Right.
they're going to be those that realize they can't have a controlling interest in hyperscale because the investment's too big. Look at the $40 billion
Right.
one just the other day, right? And I think you're going to see a lot of infrastructure funds that wanted hyperscale come back down. So I think the economy and I think the market, it's not going to ever be controlled by data center related, but I think whatever percentage of the market today the economy today is impacted by data centers, I think 5 years from now, it's going to be measurably larger. And that's kind of how I leave my forecast. And I hope 365 and my successors there and the rest of the market just be a little prudent, because we're going to know at the end of 2027. I think we're going to know how all this AI kind of, I think we're going to have a lot
That's
more clarity,
right.
and we're
Right.
going to know how high that tide has risen.
Great. Well, with that, let's end it here, Bob. It's been really delightful to speak with you. Thank you very much. For those of you out there, if you'd like to continue this conversation with Bob, do feel free to reach out to him, or if you want to contact FSX, come to our website and hit the contact us button. So again, thank you very much again, Bob, for this really, really interesting, insightful conversation.
Thank you, Kevin. Had a lot of fun. It was great.
Thank you.